Psalm 41 is the concluding psalm of the first book of the Psalms. There are 5 books in total, and this concluding psalm starts the same way as the opening psalm did. So Psalm 1 says, "Blessed is the man," and Psalm 41 opens with, "Blessed is he." And in fact, one of the major connecting themes across all the Psalms is of the great blessing, the joy, and the wholeness that comes from walking in obedience with God. And here in Psalm 41, David, the psalmist, speaks of blessing in terms of the Lord's deliverance in time of trouble. Whether surrounded by enemies or whether on his sickbed, the Lord will protect and preserve and deliver and restore. But like Psalm 1, there is a promise, there's a condition, attached to this promise. Now, if you remember, Psalm 1 speaks of the blessing that comes from walking not in the counsel of the ungodly or standing in the way of sinners, but instead delighting in the law of the Lord. And here we do have a condition of blessing, and it's slightly different. So what we're going to do really is mainly focus on the opening verses of this psalm. What comes after is one big long prayer of David's in light of this. But what we're going to consider is the blessing first, the promise of blessing, and then we're going to think about the condition of blessing, and then we will think about the certainty of blessing. So that's the way we're going to take this psalm. Now, if we start with the promise of blessing, now blessed means, in very basic terms, happy. So this is a promise of a deep sense of contentment, joy, well-being in the life and in the heart of a believer. And the promise is fleshed out in verse 2, where it says, "The Lord will protect him and preserve his life. He will bless him in the land and not surrender him to the desire of his foes." Now, the land here, of course, is the promised land. It's Israel's God-given inheritance. And that land, as we know, was surrounded by enemies. It was a very vulnerable little strip of land, very open to attack. And yet God promises safety in that land. The person, the Israelite who enjoys God's blessing, will be safe from his enemies. In fact, he won't just survive in the land, he will flourish in the land. So it's not just going to be eking out an existence in constant fear, but it will be true life, life to the full under God's blessing. Now, of course, no one ever pretends in the Bible that the promised land was paradise. It wasn't. And it was a fallen world, and it was a world where sickness could arise. But even when sickness and ill health come, the promise is that the Lord will sustain this believer, this Israelite. He will be kept from despair and dark thoughts. And in a world without medical science, when an illness could easily prove fatal, the person under God's blessing will be restored to full health. And in a lovely way. The King James Bible renders verse 3 like this: "The Lord will strengthen him upon the bed of languishing. Thou wilt make all his bed in his sickness." So it's a lovely picture. It's as if the Lord is acting as a kind of nurse. It's as if he comes to the sick person when they're hot and they're feverish and their joints are aching, and he comes in, he makes the bed for them. He turns over the sheets. He plumps up the pillow. He refreshes them. And this is the promise here. And it has to be said, these grand statements in these opening 3 verses are not gold-plated absolute promises for us that the Lord will always restore to full health the believer who's ill. We do have to remember when this was written, this is Old Testament Israel, under the Old Covenant, and it's a time when both promise and curse were primarily realised in the material. And we also have to remember who is writing this. This is David. This is God's king. This is the Messiah of his day. Yes, David takes up the truth of this blessing, and he's confident that he will know this blessing, but we have to remember who he was. He was particularly opposed because of who he was, and therefore he was particularly protected by God. He wasn't shielded from every trial, but David was protected and preserved because he was God's king. There was more at stake here than just David's physical health. So, as we read this, we can't extrapolate from this psalm that if I am ill, the Lord will always deliver me physically. He may not. But there are general principles here that God will keep the believer in the land of faith. He will keep the believer from falling beyond recovery into the hands of his enemies or her enemies, into the hands of sin and Satan. There are a great many enemies that can surround and waylay the Christian. We can become distracted, can't we? And we can be ensnared by the pleasures of the world. They might look good, but we can become so enamoured of them that we fall away. We can become inward focused, embittered by past hurts. We can be driven by conceit, by pride, by self-righteousness. We can be tempted by the devil or by indwelling sin. We can be weakened by difficult circumstances or compromise. Sometimes we can simply grow tired and jaded in our faith. And we can be cast down, not necessarily by our own sin, but sometimes by the sin of others. And sometimes we can just become very disillusioned and disappointed by the rejection of the gospel in our society. Lots of things. Whatever they are, whatever the specifics, these are spiritual enemies, as real as any David faced. And they can pull us down and they can bring us low. They can take our focus away from the Lord so that we stop praying, we stop reading his word, and we give up meeting with other believers and we cut ourselves off, and before long our hearts grow cold and distant, and we're stuck. We're stuck in our own sick bed. We're away from the warmth of fellowship with God. And people around us may well hope and expect our faith to collapse because they don't like what we stand for. But they will be disappointed in that, because the promise here for us is that the Lord will keep and preserve and restore us. Do you remember what it says in Jude 24? It says, "Now unto him who is able to keep you from falling." And when Jude uses the word keep, the sense of the word is to guard. And that's what God in his grace does for a Christian. When he saves a person, he puts that person under 24-hour, 7-day-a-week surveillance for life. He indwells that person by his Holy Spirit. And as Psalm 121 says, he will not let your foot slip. He who watches over you will not slumber. Indeed, he who watches over Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. God keeps us under constant, loving, watchful surveillance. Nothing escapes him. Nothing is beyond his power. And along the way, as we journey towards heaven, God has a wonderful way of refreshing our souls, whether it's through his word or perhaps through the hymns that we sing, perhaps through the fellowship of others. Whatever it is, he's able not just to keep us going, but to provide us often with unexpected inner peace, solace, that completely belies human explanation, joy in time of trial. And I think this is the essence of the promise of this psalm. We can't extrapolate from this that if I'm ill, the Lord is going to deliver me physically. I know that's what the health and wealth and prosperity gospel would probably teach from here. That's not right. But I think what we have is something far better. We can be sure of the Lord's gracious spiritual deliverance in time of evil. That's the promise of blessing. Now, secondly, the condition of blessing. And it's summed up in verse 1, and then it's developed. So verse 1, "Blessed is he who has regard for the weak. The Lord delivers him in time of trouble." Now, the weak is a general term, really, for those who are poor or helpless, and it could be anybody. I'm sure we know of people who are physically or materially at a very low ebb, that they're unable to help themselves, And this is who we're to have a regard for. And the kind of person the Lord blesses is not a sort of self-absorbed, inward-looking person who only ever talks about themselves and only ever thinks about themselves and has no time for anyone but themselves. This promise is for one who has regard for the weak. And this doesn't just mean sympathy or pity, because most reasonable people can and do feel sorry for people who are weak. This is going further than that. It goes beyond lip service or perfunctory help. To have regard is to seriously consider, to carefully think about a person's situation so that you can render concrete, practical, significant help. It's consideration with a view to help. Now, I came across an Enduring Word Bible study online, which I thought unpacked this very helpfully. So I'm just going to paraphrase what it said. To regard the weak is to trust God and be willing to give from your own resources. To regard the weak is to be kind to those in need. To regard the weak is to help those who likely will not help you in return. To regard the weak is to have a generous heart. And to regard the weak is to give for their good, not simply to make yourself feel good. That is what we are talking about here. David says such actions are blessed by God. Isn't that what Jesus says in Matthew 5 in the Beatitudes? Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Now, why is this? Why is this something that God particularly values? Well, I think it's because it reflects who he is. God is the all-powerful, the all-wise, all-sufficient, triune God. He's existed through all eternity past, and he did so without man and without angel. He was gloriously happy in that state, sufficient in who he was, didn't need anyone. And yet he freely chose to create and then sustain life on our planet. And he didn't do it because he was lonely or unfulfilled. He did it for his glory. He did it so he could demonstrate the full riches of his grace, because that's part of who he is. He's the God of all grace. This is why he chose a people for himself, little tiny Israel, the least of the nations. It's why, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians, he chose the weak and the foolish and the derided things of the world to be his church, including us. It's why he gave up his only son, so that he might demonstrate the riches of his grace, so that he might condescend to those who have nothing. Isn't this how God operates every day in our world? Every good and perfect gift is from above, James says. The air we breathe, the food we eat, the relationships we enjoy, all of it a free, gracious gift coming from the heart of God. It says in Psalm 103 that he's like a father. He has pity on us. It says he knows our frame. He remembers that we're dust. And that doesn't cause him to feel disdain for us. Quite the reverse. Psalm 68:5 says he's a father to the fatherless. He's a defender of widows, God in his holy dwelling. And then Psalm 146:9, the Lord watches over the alien. He sustains the fatherless and the widow, but he frustrates the ways of the wicked. Wickedness is going against who God is and what God does. It's why the Lord says to his people in Isaiah 1, stop doing wrong, learn to do right, seek justice, encourage the oppressed, defend the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow. And if we want a New Testament parallel to that, well, of course, James 1:27. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless as this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress. In other words, I think God is saying, imitate me, reflect me. This is who I am. This is what I stand for. So you see, the person who has regard for the poor is reflecting the character of God. And actually, they also show that they possess a proper value of themselves. They realise that they were weak and poor and helpless and were lifted by God's grace and given all things by the Lord, And that knowledge softens their heart so that in gratitude they give to others in need. And this is all why God blesses the believer who has regard for the poor. Now, if that's the condition of blessing, it begs the question, is blessing earned? Because after all, in the Old Testament, in Deuteronomy, it says that there was blessings for obedience and there was curse for disobedience. And the rest of the psalm seems to be David appealing to God on the basis of his own good works. He even says in verse 11, I know that you're pleased with me. And do you know, David wasn't lying. He was a just and compassionate king. He did defend the weak and the poor. He was a man wholeheartedly for God, without reservation. That was who he was. He was a man after God's own heart, and God was pleased with him. But that's rather worrying for us, isn't it? Are we as confident as David was? Would you feel able to pray, Lord, I know that you're pleased with me? I'm not sure that you would. I'm not sure that I would, to be honest with you. David, it seems, has earned God's favour with a life of integrity. And it could almost come across as, well, I've done my bit, Lord. Now can I have a bit of your blessing? I think I've earned it, haven't I? Why does that leave us? People who are maybe on a lesser spiritual plane to David. Well, I think what I've just outlined is the wrong approach. It is a misunderstanding of these verses, because it doesn't reckon with verse 4. That's the beginning of this long prayer of David's, which ends at the end of the psalm. And how does David begin his prayer? O Lord, have mercy on me, heal me, for I have sinned against you. So David may have been a man of integrity, but he was still just a man, like us. He was not perfect. Whether or not David is thinking of a specific sin here, or whether he is speaking generally, we don't know, because the historical circumstances of the psalm are not clear. They do seem to match up to that time of Absalom's rebellion, but we don't know. But one thing is clear, the Lord's blessing is not something David inherently deserves, and he knows it. He was a sinner, and in fact, verse 12 is a prayer that the Lord will uphold him in his integrity. So in other words, without the Lord, David's integrity would just vanish into the dust. And here is the secret to David's confidence. He is utterly confident that he will know the blessing of God, the mercy and grace of the Lord, because his confidence isn't in himself. It's in the character of God. You see, as I've already said, every good and perfect gift is from above. Blessing is from above. And it's all part of God's grace and his mercy to us. And of course, grace and mercy by their nature can't be earned. They can't be deserved. If they could be earned, they would be a wage. And there's only one kind of wage that the Bible talks about. Romans 6, the wages of sin is death. That's getting exactly what we deserve and what our life has earned. Death. All have sinned. All have fallen short of the glory of God. And even believers are, the long and short of it, but sinners. Saved sinners, but sinners who continue to sin. So there's no way in the world that we merit God's blessing, and our confidence of God's blessing can never be in our own good works. But because of who he is, God gives to the helpless. While we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And this is David's confidence. This, thirdly, is the certainty of blessing. And the certainty is in the person of the Lord who had lifted David up so many times before. Again and again in this psalm, verse 1, verse 2, verse 3, verse 4, verse 10, David speaks to the Lord. And he refers to him in verse 13 as the Lord, the God of Israel, from everlasting to everlasting. So he's the focus clearly here, the covenant God of Israel. David's refuge is in this everlasting, unchanging God of steadfast love and mercy, who makes promises and then faithfully sticks to those promises. And as we read these verses in this prayer, it's obvious, isn't it, that we're not dealing with a newcomer to grace. David is a mature believer. He has long been accustomed to praying to this relational God, this God of steadfast love and mercy. And David has a wonderful track record of answers to his cries for mercy. And it reassures him that he will experience mercy again. So it's the Lord and not David's integrity that gives David this foothold of confidence. The irony of this psalm, which is so concerned with blessing, is that David actually feels far from blessed. The picture we have of David here is of a beleaguered man. He's on his sickbed. He's surrounded by enemies. You can't wait to twist the knife. They can't wait for him to die. And just to rub salt into the wounds, verse 9, David's been betrayed by one of his closest friends. And this is a reference to Ahithophel, David's long-standing close advisor, who suddenly turned against him and supported Absalom's rebellion, which was such a blow to David. So the picture here is of friend and foe turned against David, so he hardly feels blessed. And yet for all that, David has this supreme heavenly friend. He has the covenant Lord. And David is confident that this Lord of past mercies will again protect and preserve and deliver and restore him. In fact, verse 12, David's even confident that he will never be cast out of God's presence. You uphold me and set me in your presence forever. Which is quite a remarkable statement. David is actually saying that he doesn't believe that death will be the end of his relationship with God. That forevermore he will be in God's presence. And in fact, verse 11, my enemy does not triumph over me. That's present tense. It's as if David already anticipates the answer and experiences the answer. It's as if he thinks, well, I'm still here. Humanly speaking, I shouldn't be, but I am, because God has already heard me. And it's not because of his own goodness. It's because who God is. And it's in the light of who God is that David says, blessed is the man who has regard for the weak. This is true blessing. It's to know what it is to be weak yourself, and yet to possess such confidence even in trial, even in adversity, even in death. And it's the blessing of true faith, of being aware of your own sinful weakness and trusting wholly in the God who has regard for the weak, the God who saves us and delivers us from every trial. Now, none of this, of course, denies the condition of the promise that we've just talked about. None of this is a denial of God's hard demand of us, that we are to obey him by reflecting him in his character, by cultivating soft hearts, by freely showing mercy to those in need. But here's the point. To live that way, it doesn't come from self-interest. It doesn't come, well, I'll do this in order to get a blessing from God. This way of life, for that's what it is, this way of living comes from understanding how much you have received from God. It comes from meditating daily upon the grace of God. And what we know and what we cherish in our hearts and what we rehearse in our minds will be reflected in how we live. We will naturally wish to reflect God's goodness by showing love and mercy to others. It will come from the overflow of a heart that has been softened by God's grace. And that way of life is the true way of blessing. It's more than just a deliverance from a physical illness. To live in this way is to remove hindrances in prayer. And it means that although you aren't perfect, you will be able to approach God in good conscience and with confidence and seek his mercy in your time of need. And you will know his blessing. But I think the warning is that confidence must never, ever, ever morph into self-confidence. Because self-confidence is the preserver of the proud, and self-confidence does not require grace or mercy. Because self-confidence pays for its own keep. And because a self-confident person doesn't want grace and has no need of grace, self-confident people cannot receive God's grace. Therefore, they will not be blessed. They will not be delivered from sin and from Satan. So, as we close, who does this psalm apply to? Who is the blessed man? Well, it's the man who has regard for the weak. And that is a picture of David, who did indeed have regard for the weak. He was a good king. But it is actually a picture of every true believer. This is who we are if we are believers. We are people who live under God's blessing. We are debtors to grace and mercy. We're people who have been set free from sin and Satan and enabled to live God's way and show God's love and mercy to others. Now, of course, we fall short of perfection. And like David, we have to confess sometimes, "O Lord, have mercy on me, heal me, for I've sinned against you again." And yet, like David, this reality of our own depraved hearts simply turns us back to our loving Lord and Saviour. And in him, we can be confident. We can be confident that he will indeed keep us from falling, that he will preserve our souls, and that by his Spirit, we will grow increasingly to be the people he's called us to be. Salt and light, means of grace in a world full of needy people. And that is blessing. It's the life of blessing. And as we finish, of course, the man who has regard for the weak is ultimately and prophetically the Lord Jesus Christ. This is a little snapshot, a little picture of the Son of Man. We remember, don't we, that Christ was betrayed by a close friend who shared his bread. And that betrayal led to Christ being arrested and put on trial and then beaten and then hung on a cross. It was the grossest violation of injustice, the grossest failure of mercy that there's ever been in our world, humanly speaking. And yet it was meant to be, wasn't it? It was for our sakes that Christ died. It was precisely because Christ has regard for the weak that while we were sinners and enemies, he died for us. We are blessed because Christ was cursed. And that's the truth that we've got to never ever forget. And may the Lord use that truth, the gospel, to keep our hearts soft, so that we have a regard for those who are perishing, those who in truth are just like we were, and just like we still are, helpless and weak and in need of a Saviour. Amen.